Next, we come on to a story about milk, and specifically the point at which humans began uh, feeding their offspring, feeding their children, milk from animals, so goat milk, probably cow milk, and this is a practice which is very common, for example, in Europe, less common in other parts of the world. But it seems that we found now essentially baby bottles, or as one person I saw describe it as almost like sippy cups. And these are fascinating. But what I really find pleasing about these vessels is that these are Bronze Age and Iron Age examples from Bavaria. In a photo I'm looking at here, is the way that actually you can almost imagine the sort of like, here comes the choo-choo train, because it's an animal. It's an animal ceramic
Yeah,
into
yeah.
which you put milk, and they seemingly drink it out of the tail, almost like a pipe, I suppose. Uh,
Mm.
and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful example. Or, no, sorry. In another photo, it looks like they are, but in this case, maybe you just drink it out of the top. But it's a wonderful example of the realities of feeding a child some milk, and which we can still relate to today. But also, it's a little touchstone to a fundamental change in the way people related to the world around them, and actually a change that we're still living with today. Arguably, the foundations of, for example, land ownership, so on and so forth, were set at this time,
Mm.
in terms of the Neolithic through to the Iron Age. So I find this story both cute but also profound. Plus, as well, they have fantastic feet, little boots on their feet. These animals. Uh,
Yeah,
what do you think of this?
it's a fascinating story. I mean, it reminds me of going back to my module on animal bones and talking about milk production in the ancient world and the cultural attitudes to milk and dairy products. The the idea that certain populations have a higher incidence of lactose intolerance
Hmm.
because milk was never a significant part of the diet
No.
in certain regions of the world.
Hmm.
Um, and I think one of the things it brought back to me as well is why perhaps the archaeology of food, although food is so fundamental to us, is still a relatively niche study area
Hmm.
because actually a lot of the evidence by its very nature gets consumed, and that which limits the evidence you've got for what people are eating to two things really. Well, obviously there's what comes out the other end, so coprolites,
Hmm. Hmm.
which obviously can give significant input when it comes to diets.
Hmm.
So as you can identify where those come, if they're from adults or if they're from children or whatever. Um, but before it goes through the human system, it goes through a production system, whether it's gathered or hunted or farmed or whatever. And while animal bone is very durable, the way you can make assumptions about age, for example, so the age at which an animal is culled for food or sacrificed
Well,
or whatever, and so on.
or, for example, the demographics of the cull. So, for example, in a dairy herd, young male bulls will
Yeah,
be killed off more readily and earlier than in a meat
there,
herd, usually.
yeah. There's a famous instance of a temple in Essex where there were a lot of lamb bones,
Hmm.
and it was worked out that they were being killed in the early autumn at roughly 6 months.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there was obviously some sort of autumn lamb eating festival, but
Yeah.
also there's a practical thing. It's the animals that you're not going to take through the winter.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can come up with good evidence for meat. Things like if you come up with, okay, on a site you got good organic survival and you come up with, say, a blackberry pip or and some apple pips. Were they being consumed? Were they being dried out and consumed as a kind of fruit jerky,
Hmm.
or were they being eaten straight off the bush or the tree, or were they being eaten as part of a pie?
Hmm. Hmm.
You can't tell.
Hmm. No, that's true. 'Cause, yeah, yeah, the evidence for pastry I'm not sure how you would evidence that. Yeah, for example. Yeah.
Exactly,
Um,
exactly. We've got
mm,
querns. We
hmm
know. So if people are processing grains to create flour,
hmm
but then what subsequently happens to that flour, we're guessing, and we're into ethnography and comparative studies, and
hmm
things like that. And unless we get exceptional survivals. I mean, I noticed I was at the British Museum a few months back, and for the day of archaeology launch, and they had an artisan baker selling Pompeian loaves at 12 quid a pop.
Oh wow.
Uh, yeah, but yeah, modelled on the loaves that were carbonized in the baker's shops in Pompeii,
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
using spelt flour and
Uh-huh.
classic grains and stuff. So
And how do you
there
spell
you had
flower?
spelt
Oh,
flour.
oh, I see. Sorry. Sorry.
Sorry, final consonants, proper speech.
Indeed, over the teeth and through the lips. Uh, and just I suppose coming back to this application, then in particular, this is very interesting because it's commenting on an aspect of human society that often is either difficult to evidence or not often explicitly examined. Partly because it's difficult to evidence, namely the experience of children and childhood in the past, and it has a couple of potential impacts. One of them is contributing to population explosion. So if a mother isn't nursing herself or for herself, and is instead able to rely on milk coming from cattle or goats, then she's potentially more likely to be able to have another child more quickly. And the another example here as well is of a implied potential question is the way in which now milk also is being attached to childhood in terms of an aspect of childhood, suckling on uh, on the milk of another creature, seemingly becomes also tied to the grave. So we have some burials from this time between 1200 and 450 BC, where infants are buried with their bottle, with their sippy cup, with their and that's an interesting development. Again, it's all of these things are you're talking in broad sweeps and in language which is quite abstract, but it all has an impact on how people are relating to their world and the animals around them, and in this instance as well, how those animals are impacting on the nature of what it is to be a child. It's very interesting, and it's really good. This is good work in so much as it's attaching often under asked questions to burial archaeology.
Can I
Yep.
make a couple of comments there as
Mhm,
well that lead on from what you've just said? That obviously anybody who's had children, I've been lucky enough to have that experience. Um, you go through the ritual of cleaning and sterilizing bottles when
mm,
they're particularly when they're younger,
mhm, mhm,
um, until you realise that there's no way to stop them going into the garden and eating mud. Um, and but the point is that possibly um, culturally and in terms of uh, general health and well-being, stopping breastfeeding and going on to something like a cup, which can be a harbour for infection
mhm.
or bacteria, whatever.
Particularly these slightly awkward
Um,
shaped vessels. It's hard to get in there and
that can't,
yeah.
yeah, and I don't, that there might be potentially. Again, I don't know. I'm throwing it out as a question. There may
Mhm,
be there may be other negative impacts actually
mhm,
in
mhm,
that. It was the idea of a child being buried with a cup as an emblem
mhm,
of childhood. Made me immediately think of that. With
mm,
if you're passing on an infection or listeria or something like that,
mhm.
we know is present in milk, in animal milk.
Well, and then I suppose that there's
And
there's an attendant question there as well, in so much as is a little bit like eating the mud, is exposure to those bacterial elements
boost the
actually
immune
boosting
system.
immune system? Yeah, so
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
other
Yeah,
attendant questions to ask and answer. Yeah.
that's
Mm,
but the other point I'm making is simply about why hasn't this been looked at so much before? And I think again, our women colleagues might say, because archaeology in the past has been far too male dominated, and talking about bringing up babies and so on isn't really kind of male stuff. We'd much rather be talking about going out hunting with a spear and the atlatl and how
Mm.
effective a gladius is.
Yeah, yeah.
You
Well,
know,
and when you're looking at Bronze Age and Iron Age archaeology, the number of people who rush to make a kiln to cast some bronze is
yeah,
quite numerable. There's quite a few examples of that. Whereas, yeah, so in this instance, this is Sean Halcrow of the University of Otago in New
New
Zealand,
Zealand, yeah.
and she. Acknowledges here that further work is needed to explore the effects of introducing animal milk as infant food. But fascinating, and I simply had to highlight this month. I think
I
it's
just make the other observation. We're looking at a BBC report
mhm.
on this, and one of the other authorities they quote is also a woman, Dr. Julie Dunn of University of Bristol.
Yeah, yeah, excellent, really good, good work.